Well, the fight against terrorism today requires a much deeper understanding of digital advancements than before and how terror groups are progressing in adopting such innovations. One terror expert says this is a key challenge faced by Singapore and countries around the world when it comes to keeping increasingly sophisticated threats at bay. This comes on the backdrop of 20 years after Singapore's closest shave with Islamist terrorism. Back then, the Internal Security Department cracked terror group Jemaah Islamiyah's plot to launch terror attacks against Singapore. For more insights on how the terror landscape is evolving, we're joined by Dr. Jolene Jerard from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Dr. Jerard, with the Taliban regaining some power in Afghanistan, all those ripple effects are expected to come across Southeast Asia, including Singapore. How big a threat do you see the group posing here?
I think in terms of the scale of the threat and the level of threat as we're thinking about a group like Jemaah Islamiyah, certainly over the last 20 years or so, you have seen how the group itself has evolved. But with the surrounding environment, when we're thinking about the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, certainly allowing like-minded groups such as Al-Qaeda to thrive within its environment. So in terms of the allowances that it provides for like-minded groups, as well as the fact that when you're thinking about how JI and like-minded groups within our region have evolved, you are certainly considering the fact that where Al-Qaeda is concerned, where the hotspots of terror are concerned, where the Taliban is focused on today, it provides an avenue for them to see the value of the long game. And it has for them that strategic ambit of a moral vindication, which they too want to emulate within the region, given JI's historical links to Al-Qaeda in the past.
Dr. Jerard, terror groups have been known to use the online space for communications, particularly on the dark web, as an example. And this pandemic has just accelerated the amount that we're using that online space and digitalization. Beyond Jemaah Islamiyah, have terror threats across the region increased at all? How does that affect us?
I think when we're looking at the scale of terror attacks and terror threats in general, one of the main indicators that are sometimes being used is the number of attacks. But in addition to the number of attacks, sometimes what we fail to consider would be this broadened spectrum of what we would include in trying to make a threat assessment. The number of attacks is one, but in addition to that, it includes the number of interdicted plots, the number of arrests that have taken place, for example. All of these go into making the entirety of what would constitute a threat assessment. So in terms of the scaling up, certainly we've seen increased discussions online, increasingly even within the international community, as well as security professionals around the world. We have been looking at the increased discussions online in the deep web, the dark web, as well as even on gaming platforms.
Now, let's shine a bit of a spotlight on Singapore itself. And based on how the terror groups are evolving and how fast they are morphing, what sort of capabilities, what are the gaps that, Singapore is displaying right now?
I think in terms of how the groups have continued to evolve, certainly they use the landscape that is present, as you rightfully pointed out, the role of technology. So this transformative power technology contributing to a dense cross-pollination of ideas between and amongst groups across the spectrum. We're looking at recruitment and radicalization ongoing as well. All of this contributing to innovative strategies and innovative tactics that the groups are using. So the shoring up of efforts, especially within this environment, has led to, especially within our region, the need to build capacity in trying to understand how the augmented landscape through digitization, through the use of digital platforms, continue to increase recruitment and radicalization.
And so in light of the threat assessment of that cross-pollination of ideas, as you put it, Dr. Jerard. How timely is the warning today that's been issued by MUIS against these so-called deviant spiritual teachings, self-radicalization, that is seen as a main terror threat here? Far-right extremism as well is an emerging one.
So I think it's certainly a timely reminder where we are thinking about available strategies that are in place. So as we look at the array of modes and methods to combat and counter terrorism, certainly we have seen an evolution in these strategies as well. So while in the past you would think about more punitive measures of just purely legislative efforts alone, today you're looking at efforts of partnership with the community, and with that partnership comes available resources, such as what you rightfully pointed out, things like the ARS scheme, for example. And in that process, while these platforms are available, it is also the onus of the community to make use of these vital platforms. So today we have seen that evolution, and we have seen this shift in terms of how not only the groups have evolved, but in terms of patterns of how countries, including Singapore, have been moving forward and evolving its strategies in order to mitigate and isolate the threat.
I'm wondering whether you can be a bit more specific with us about those particular strategies that you see evolving. And you know, will we ever get to a point where we actually get ahead of the curve, you know, rather than just following it?
I think that is the concerted aspiration always, to try and to do the level best to get ahead of the curve, as you rightfully pointed out. I think a military strategist or had once pointed out the idea was what they called an OODA loop. You observe, you orient, you decide, and you act. A consistently evolving threat scenario has meant that today we are also called to think about strategies ahead in terms of how to get ahead of the curve. And in doing so, building capacity within our region, building capacity in terms of the role of technology and how technology can augment not only understanding the threat, but at the same time trying to get ahead of the curve in trying to mitigate some of these efforts, or mitigate and isolate and contain the threat completely. But in doing so, we recognize the fact that terrorism is and will continue to evolve, and our strategies will continue to have to evolve as well, as much as we try to get ahead of it. The way to move towards a preventative effort or move towards strategies to prevent violent extremism, often enough, it involves working with the community.
We have to leave it there for now. Dr. Jolene Jerard, who is the Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Study. Thank you so much for your take.